Hello, and welcome to the next module about film history and historiography. Now, we're going to examine many of the different ways that we can study film from a historical standpoint, and we'll look at some of the problems with studying film history and just studying history in general. So let's take a look at some of the challenges faced in historical research. Now, the biggest challenge is that there's usually a lack of historical evidence. Now, this means that these artifacts from the past no longer exist, or they were not preserved, and often they are found in archaeological digs. Now with film, this is especially true because many of the earliest films were either lost or destroyed. There's also the reliance of dominant narratives or apocryphal stories that have questionable validity that are accepted as true. There are biased sources like personal diaries, letters, government documents, so on, that people have maybe misinterpreted or are written from a particular point of view. There are other biases like national, gender, etc. There's also incomplete information. Now, not all the events of the past were documented. Now, even though film is a relatively new medium, that is most certainly the case, especially in the early days of film. And then there are interpretation varieties, meaning that different historians come up with different conclusions. And this is one of the things that we need to look at with the concept of historiography, the main topic of this particular unit. So historiography is defined as the study of methods through which historians organize and write about the past. Let's now take a look at some of the different types of film historiography. The first is the aesthetic approach. Now this is defined by the study of how the visual and oral sound elements of film have changed over time and what external factors drove those changes. So some examples of this would be black and white versus color film and the economic and technological limitations that led to the appearance and proliferation of transition from black and white to color. Next, we move on to the technological approach. Now this examines the circumstances surrounding cinematic technology and the developments and advancements, and how these affected film structure, content, aesthetics, and economics. So we could take a look at some examples of these would be the new camera technologies. So going from black and white film to color film, and then also the transition from actual film to digital was another major effect. Different aspect ratios. There were many factors that led to the changing of the relatively square form of early film because of television. Television was a major competitor when it became prolific after World War II, and it really cut into film viewing. And so that's when the film industry decided, well, we need to make something a little bit different than television, the square, so they decided to go with different aspect ratios, things like widescreen, cinerama, anamorphic, all of those different types of things were ways of trying to get people out of their homes and watch films in the theater and not just watch television. Then we look at the economic approach. Now this examines the economic conditions of the film industry and society at large on film structure, content, aesthetics, and technologies. Moving on to the socio-historic approach, it's defined as how films were created and evolved due to cultural, political, and social conditions and their effects on film structure, content, and aesthetics. Some examples of this would be how certain groups were represented throughout film history, and unfavorable stereotypes were created and perpetuated by the repeated appearance of them in film. However, that is starting to change with more favorable and accurate representations in film. Censorship was also a very big influence in what appeared in film. So now we're going to move on to some other approaches, what is known as the great man approach. Now this is defined by examining artistic excellence and significance and influence of past filmmakers on future filmmakers in terms of style and content. Now there is a certain amount of truth to this, however there are certain limitations of this. So we look at what were the significant works of cinematic art, who were and are the significant directors, and why are their movies important. Now, as I said earlier, many of the early films are lost. According to the Library of Congress, they estimate that 75% of all American silent films are lost as of 2013. That's a very significant number of films that could have told us so much more about the history of film and potentially about society at that time that are now gone. There are also criticisms of another criticism of this approach is that there are gender and racial biases. Almost always the early filmmakers were white males, and they were the ones that dominated the discussion and the dialogue. However, now we're starting to see that that is not necessarily the case, and people of color and women are now being recognized for their early contributions. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the periodization approach. Now, this is the one that you'll see in the textbook. Now, I'm not going to cover all the different periods in great detail, but you will be expected to examine them and look for some of the prominent figures and films from the past. So again, the periodization approach is simply by dividing the history of cinema into distinct time periods based on significant technological, artistic, and cultural shifts. Now, according to the textbook, these are the significant periods in film history that you'll be responsible for. So we're going to look at the silent era, which started in 1895 and ended in 1927. Moving on to the classical cinema, which is also known as the sound era, starting in 1929 and moving into 1945. Then we have the post-war cinemas that were from 1945 to 1975. And there's cinematic globalization from 1975 to 2000. And cinema in the digital era, 2000 to the present. Now, there are many different film movements that simply can't cover in this lecture, but you will need to look at them, like the New Hollywood movement or the blockbuster movement, and some foreign film movements, and also the new wave cinemas. All of those are encompassing in this particular periodization approach. So that concludes the historiography learning module. And now it's time for you to do the short film clip viewing assignment.